But to start, I've got a question, and this question might be hard-hitting. It's a question that we don't often talk about, especially in today's society. And the question is this: how do you deal with your own weakness? How do you deal with your own weakness? When it feels like everything is stacked against you, when your work sucks, your family life is really challenging, you're completely shattered, and you have people out for you because of what you believe in. When all of these countless pressures mount up, how do we deal with our own weakness? The world motivates us to just keep going on our own. As spoken in a famous song, I get knocked down, but I get up again. You're never going to keep me down. Many others will say that you just need to give up what's causing you all of this pressure. Find a new wife, find a new husband, give up that job, find a new house. Get rid of all these unrealistic things in your life. But this evening we're going to see that God doesn't want this for us. Instead, the attitude we should have for our weakness is to embrace it, embrace our own weakness, because it's in our weakness that we can accept his strength. And well, this evening we're going to see a man in a very similar situation to what was been described. Nehemiah, a man who we've seen recently has been dealing with kings and officials and enemies of his people. And today we find him dealing again with the enemies of Jerusalem. And they've come at the moment of his weakness. We've seen a couple of weeks ago how the people are weak, they are tired. And this is the moment that they have chosen to strike. But his example this evening is what we should seek to imitate. A man who, in this chapter, sees his own weakness and lets God use his own weakness to achieve his plans for both the Israelites and the nations around him. But as we start this evening, we're going to see two characters and both of their methods as we trace through this evening. The first is Satan's power is opposition. Satan's power is opposition. And all throughout this book so far, we have seen Israel's enemies unwittingly working for enemy number one. These enemies have posed so much of a threat that Nehemiah commands all of the people to take a sword with them when they go and get water at the end of chapter 4. These opponents want the wall construction to end and will try all manner of ways to stop this. Look with me, starting in verse 2. Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message, "Come, let's meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono." But they were scheming to harm me. These enemies have taken to eliminating the problem at its root. Nehemiah himself. After all, it was his return that sparked this renewed desire to rebuild. Jerusalem presents a problem for these other nations, another power to contend with. So if they eliminate this power before it grows too big, well then, well done. So they try to convince Nehemiah to abandon his work, to give up on what he's doing under this pressure. But Nehemiah simply rejects this, realizing that they intend to harm him and probably kill him. Now, these enemies' threats start physically with bodily harm as a motivator to stop the work. They hope that they can wear him down, but in quite humorous fashion, it seems Nehemiah just hits control, copy, paste, and sends the same response 4 times. But these enemies, well, they don't take this lying down. So they send yet another letter in verse 5. Look with me. Then the fifth time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message in his hand. And in his hand was an unsealed letter, in which was written, "It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it's true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt and therefore are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king, so come, let us meet together." And this is the second tactic that the enemies here are using. They're lying blatantly. They've given up with the physical threats for the moment and now aim for the emotional core of Nehemiah, to get under his skin, to cease this work. But it all feels a bit childish, doesn't it? It kind of feels like playground politics is happening. Sanballat is saying all of these lies and saying his mate says that these are true as a scare tactic. And well, to be fair, it's worked before. I mean, until Nehemiah has come back, people hadn't been building the wall. Nothing had been done. These lies and threats were intimidating. And by making it a public letter, this now involves the whole city. Rumors and scandals spreading through the area in the hope that the work will stop. These enemies, they're persistent and keen, and use the big threat of the bigger king to stop the walls from being built. Now you can imagine, if you're Nehemiah at the moment, the pressure landing on your shoulders is growing immensely. You've gone from just personal attacks, which probably you can keep to yourself, to now publicly other people are saying these things about you. But the enemies aren't done. We see that after this open letter is refuted by Nehemiah as pure scandal, he goes to a prophet's house in Jerusalem and hears this invite to go and hide away in the temple. Look at verse 10. One day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of Metabel, who was shut in at his home. He said, "Let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you." You can imagine Nehemiah standing in this prophet's house, just thinking, what is going on? This cannot be of God. Why would God command this? We see the enemies have switched again up. They've switched their tactics again. They've gone from emotional to spiritual, attacking the very being of Nehemiah himself. If we can trick him into losing what he values the most, well, then we've won. Nehemiah, realizing that now opposition has got inside the city, you can imagine the pressure is just getting immense. It's like everything is slowly getting too much for him. What can he do against all this pressure? What can he do with his own weakness? Well, let's look at verse 9, because that's where his response is. Verse 9 says this: they were trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. Nehemiah's response in the midst of immeasurable pressure is prayer. That was an instant reaction. He receives these threats. His instant reaction is to go to God in prayer, to commit everything to him. Instead of trying to solve the problem himself in his own strength or just giving up and doing something else, he goes to the person that can give him strength to get through it. Nehemiah was writing this because, while the original readers of this, they needed to know what behavior sent them into exile. And it was behavior of giving up and doing it on our own that sent the people into exile in the first place. I mean, we only saw last week what the nobles were doing to their own people. They needed to know that God was going to keep his promises even under pressure. And Nehemiah writes this to the future generation, saying, yes, there will be pressure, there will be threats. But God will still achieve what he sets out to do. And Satan will seek to oppose all those who call on the name of the Lord, to attack them physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And Nehemiah wants his descendants to not fall into this pitfall of self-belief, self-glorification, and just powering on. He wants them to be very aware of what the enemy is capable of. And today we see opposition hasn't changed, has it? Jesus himself faced opposition by the Pharisees. He faced enemies within his own disciples and was killed as crowds jeered at him. And today, schools, universities, jobs, home life, the enemy seeks to get in wherever he can, to make you feel as weak as possible. That is his goal. That is the enemy's main goal, is to make you feel as weak as possible so you will give up the work. But as we're going to see after the break, what makes us weak? Well, that's actually our greatest strength. We're going to take a little break here, and there's going to be a question that appears on the screen behind me. And it's going to say, how do we face these kinds of opposition today? And what is our natural response when we face it? So we've got a couple of minutes. Let's discuss these around our tables, and then I'll come up and finish up. If you want to bring your discussions to a close, don't worry, there's more time after to continue these discussions. But hopefully those discussions were key and informative in really enforcing how opposition is really present today and how we can often be left feeling incredibly weak under it. And we left off thinking how the enemy will want us to feel weak and unable to continue the work that's been set out. But we're going to see in this section that this is how God is going to become most glorified. His power is made perfect through weakness, and that's going to be our second character and method today. God's power is through weakness. God's power is through weakness. But let's quickly look at the big achievement of the passage. You might have been like, oh, Josh, come on, like something's happened in this passage. Let's chat about it. Like, the wall is completed. It's done. The wall is built and it's completed. Finally, we've got there. The wall that Nehemiah has gone to build alongside his fellow brothers is completed. And we read it in verse 15. So the wall was completed on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. Nehemiah has done what he has set out to do, and this is a huge miracle. Do we see that this is a huge miracle? Remember, this is a city that is full of people that are completely weak and tired and exhausted, and yet this wall is built in 52 days. 52 days this is built. That means if they started on the 1st of January this year, the wall is already done. It is completed. But for a bit of context as to why I'm getting so excited about this is ancient city walls took a long time to build. They weren't like our brick walls today that get put up in a couple of days and fall over when we get a bit of wind. No, these walls were massive and surrounded entire cities. One of my favorite holidays I've ever been on was to the country of Malta, and this was my first experience of an ancient city. We went to the capital city, which is this place called Valletta, and we got to explore and see these walls up close and personal. Now, these walls are massive and thick, and they are 5 kilometers long if you were to walk across the top of them, 5 kilometers in length. And the construction of these walls, well, that took 5 years to build. 5 years to build 5 kilometers. That's not bad, is it? That's a kilometer a year. It's pretty good. Whereas the walls in Jerusalem were 2.7 kilometers in length, and it took them 52 days to put them up. That is an amazing display of God's work. Do we really see how God has used an entire people who are absolutely shattered to build a city wall of 2.7 kilometers in 52 days? That is a fraction of the time it took other people to build the walls in Valletta. And we see that this miracle, well, this is witnessed by the enemies of the people. And the enemies, well, they can see that God has his hand on his people. He heard the prayer of Nehemiah. He strengthened his hands and the hands of the people. And we see this as we read on in verse 16. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Enemies and nations have recognized that this work could only have been done because God was behind it. And they can clearly see that it is not the Israelites doing it on their own. One of the best children's books ever written is The Gruffalo, an absolute classic. But if you're unfamiliar with this literary masterpiece, let me fill you in. It focuses on a character. The main character is a mouse, and this mouse goes for a stroll through the woods one day and is confronted by 3 animals, 3 predators, a fox, an owl, and a snake, all of which pose a huge threat to the mouse. The mouse is defenseless. The mouse can't fight them off. And the mouse tells them a story about his friend, the Gruffalo, in an attempt to dissuade them from trying to attack him. And while these animals, they're a little bit afraid and they go off, they don't really believe the mouse. But it's only when the titular Gruffalo appears towards the end of the story that these animals really see the Gruffalo for who he is. The confidence of these predators washes away in the face of the Gruffalo that walks behind the mouse through the woods. And in the same way, we see the mouse walk confidently because of who is standing behind him. And in the same way, this happens in our story. We see this masterpiece that happens. It's crafted amazingly. We see the same way Israel's enemies' confidence dissipates as they witness the God of the universe standing behind the people who have built the wall. They see this work akin to the Exodus, where all of the nations, well, they're in fear of this people because they see God's work clearly around them. And the nations, they know this can only have been done by God because they know how weak the people inside the city are. They have been barraging them for 52 days with threats of violence and pressure. And yet, in 52 days, they've built an almost 3-kilometer wall. That cannot have been the Israelites on their own. That can only have been God's strength in them. But let's come back to Nehemiah's prayer. This is one of the many prayers that Nehemiah utters in this book. And just like the one that he says to the king, it's short and to the point. And in this prayer, Nehemiah recognizes his own frailty. He knows that in order to do what God has called him to do, he needs God's strength behind him. And notice how he doesn't try to solve the problem first. He doesn't do anything on his own. Instead, he asks for strength. Instead, this is a knee-jerk reaction, and almost just straight off the cuff. This is the thing I do in prayer. And again, this is a record for the people coming after Nehemiah of the correct response when facing opposition. He knows that God is faithful and will build this wall and will use weak people like himself. Why? Because God is more glorified in all Israel and all the nations when weak people are used to achieve it. And the other nations, well, they're humbled in their attitude towards the living God. Their courage is sapped away, and they are left standing in awe. And we see the inhabitants of Jerusalem and Nehemiah himself are now vindicated. Their hard work and God's grace has allowed them to build the wall. But look with me at 19. Moreover, they kept recording to me his good deeds and telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. After the wall had been rebuilt and I set the doors in place, the gatekeepers, the musicians, and the Levites were appointed. See, we see that there is still some opposition even after God's amazing work has been displayed. But we see Nehemiah's reaction is almost very different here. Nehemiah pays it no attention. He has been strengthened by God. The walls have been rebuilt. God has provided strength to the weak, made this amazing wall happen in 52 days. What threat could this man pose to me now? It's as if Nehemiah is sitting in his chambers and he receives this letter and he goes, oh no, anyway, let's continue with what we were doing. He pays it no attention at all because he isn't relying on his own strength here. He's relying on the strength that has been provided to him. And this is how God enacts his will, by using weakness to show his absolute glory. Because as we look ahead to the cross, we see the ultimate example of weakness. People lining the streets to see a beaten up, bruised, weak man die on a cross. Then, to make matters worse, his followers worship him. Nothing would have seemed weirder in that society than people worshipping a dead criminal. This was weak. It was humiliating. The other gods at the time, well, they were strong and powerful and had these mighty tales told about them, but not this one. To the Jewish onlooker, this was nothing remarkable, just a normal Friday evening. But the miracle of that story is that in that miracle, in that death on a cross, again, God shows his glory to other nations as well. We see this in Mark 15:39. It says this, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. It was through this death, this miracle, that the wall is visible to the other nations. When that happened, all the other nations could see that it was God doing it. And now when Jesus dies on a cross, the nations can see that was God. It was through Jesus that the barrier of sin was broken and the way was opened, and this is how it was done. This is how thousands of years of prophecy led to a beaten up carpenter on a cross. And to spread this gospel, it's given to 12 illiterate fishermen and tax collectors. How weak is that? Yet it was these men that spread the gospel around the world. God uses the weak to show his glory, because when his glory is seen, it cannot have been the individual doing it. Nehemiah and the builders of the wall could not have done this by themselves, and they acknowledge that they're weak. And when it's completed, there is no self-glorification. Instead, they remember this can only have been done by God. But what does this look like today? To most non-Christians, Christ's work looks weak as ever. On the surface, it looks like we achieve nothing. In fact, it looks like we achieve less than nothing because we lose out on things. We can lose out when we honor our boss and don't disrespect him behind his back in the staff room. When your school friends ridicule you because you don't go out drinking. When your uni mates look down on you because you're not sleeping around like the rest of them. When family members shut you out because you keep going on about this Jesus bloke. When it feels like we've just been run into the ground by work, it can seem like absolute weakness. Do I just keep going on my own strength? Do I give up, find something else to do? May I encourage you this evening to pray like Nehemiah. When Nehemiah felt like this, he prayed. Because if in each and every one of those situations, if we prayed like Nehemiah did, if our prayer is now strengthen my hands, how much will our work change? How much will our attitudes towards other people change? When we realize that the work we've been called to in each and every day of our lives is valuable and important for God's kingdom. As we embrace our own weakness, we enable God to work through us. This has been an immense challenge for myself this last week as I sought to emulate Nehemiah in my own prayer life, to make it a simple knee-jerk reaction that in every situation, the first thing I do is to pray to God. Because in each and every one of these encounters, the kingdom is being built. It's being built in society, it's being built in us. And yes, it will hurt. It doesn't mean that everything will be sunshine and rainbows for the rest of your life. It will cost you. But it will lead to the Lord being glorified in us. So pray like Nehemiah, who saw his own weakness and saw his own need for God. It was his first reaction to ask God for strength, knowing that as he stepped out in faith, this work that God had called him to do, the Creator God stood behind him every step of the way and strengthened him. How would tomorrow look if we walked into our workplace, having prayed this prayer, knowing the God of the universe stands behind you, that your work is valuable, your work is vital to the kingdom? How would that look? It would look pretty amazing, right? If that was our prayer each and every day as we stepped out in faith to pray, Lord, strengthen my hands, and God would be glorified in each and every one of us all the more. Let's pray. Lord God, we praise you this evening that in our weakness you are glorified. Lord, that you would choose a weak death on a cross in order to save everyone. Lord, you have strengthened our hands for the work you equipped us for. Father, may we know that you stand behind us as we step out into our workplaces, into our families this week. Lord, that you are the one that stands behind us and strengthens us. Strengthen our hands this week, Lord. Amen. Hand back to Phil.